Hello, and welcome to today's web seminar, End-to-End Testing with AI, sponsored by testRigor and featuring Artem Golubev. Before our presentation begins, please let me explain the console. The panel on the right has a feature to chat, ask questions, answer polls, or download the slide deck for today. If you minimize this panel, just click on the chat button to reopen it. If you experience any technical issues, please send me, Sarah Crocker, a private chat, and I'll be happy to help you. There will be a Q&A session at the end, but feel free to enter your questions at any time throughout the presentation. To optimize your bandwidth for the best viewing experience, please close any other applications you may have running in the background. This event is being recorded and will be made available to watch on demand. Once the recording is ready, you'll get an email with instructions on how to access the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Artem.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. And today I will be talking about end-to-end testing with AI. Thank you, TechWell, for hosting us. Okay. So why AI and why this is specifically important for end-to-end testing, and what exactly are we talking about here? So when we're talking about end-to-end testing, it can concern a lot of different things, even end-to-end testing, not just testing in general. It could be web, mobile, API, IoT devices, cars, self-driving, and this and that, and 10,000 other different things. Here today, we will specifically be talking about web and mobile, and I will just briefly touch API. And by the way, looks like polls came out in about 15 minutes. We'll get the result, and I'll talk to that as well. So why are we talking about this in general, and why do we need AI in the first place in end-to-end testing? Well, as you very well know, test automation had been around since 1990s. Is not something new. However, in 2022, 70% of all tests are executed manually still. And the problem is it actually resulting in $1.7 trillion in losses due to bugs because people just can't retest all the functionality all the time. Think about it. In 2022, the requirements is such that companies oftentimes release on daily or almost daily basis, even if they are multi-billion-dollar enterprises. Why? Oftentimes it is just related to security, even if a new feature is not ready to release yet. And the company is not really on a continuous delivery schedule. Nevertheless, from time to time, security vulnerabilities in the libraries require companies to release updates on regular cadence. So therefore, even though the larger updates might come up on certain cadence or from time to time, the smaller ones oftentimes are released quickly, and therefore, in order to be able to test them properly, we all need to have test automation. Now, getting back to the question, we have this shocking number of 70% manual. Why is it the case? Well, we also, as I mentioned, already have all of that. Well, it's because it's not that simple. As soon as you're writing tests, you need to maintain those tests. And this is where the problem coming in. It's not just that on its own, but it's usually in conjunction with the budget. As you very well know, your budget is probably somewhere in between 10 to 20% of engineering budget. This is what is allocated on QA. And because of the way Selenium IPM test works, the way we have written requires so much maintenance that it actually makes it like almost impossible to achieve certain goals. I'll speak to that in even more details in a second. So basically, since you are in the process of having very little test automation, it's usually manual, and because it's manual, it's a lot longer release cycles and bugs in production, and even automation itself is not perfect. Not only it almost always breaks, but also it oftentimes requires ginormous amount of test maintenance. Why is that? And what necessitates the change and use of machine learning and AI in order to achieve more favorable, better results? Well, here is a comparison between Selenium script and testRigor script. And testRigor script is where you write executable specification in English, and testRigor executed emulating a user interacting with web or mobile applications like a human. So as you can see, just a sheer amount of lines of code is dramatically less for testRigor, but that's not an issue in its own right. So two main issues with Selenium code is number one, well, you have to be an engineer in order to be able to understand what's going on in there. Moreover, you need to be an engineer to even understand the test failures. So if a test fails, oftentimes the stack trace is cryptic, and engineers must be involved in order to be able to understand what is happening. This is one. However, there is even larger issue which results in that huge test maintenance, and that is a reliance on details of implementation. Here, as you can see, the ID, the test on the left relies on IDs, on the name, and on XPath, a little bit below. And that is a big challenge, because what's going on is then people write Selenium on IPM test, they hook up into how the page is implemented at that given moment, and therefore as soon as the page rendering changes ever so slightly, or engineers change UI framework or update the library of our UI framework, so on and so forth, then a Selenium test would break for no reason. And think about it, there's two issues in that. So number one, it incurs unimaginably huge amount of maintenance for no particular reason. And number two, it makes those tests basically not helpful, be kind of useless. Why? Because this is those changes, updates in the libraries, updates in how things are rendered, is exactly when engineers would expect to be able to rely on end-to-end tests specifically in order to be able to understand if things are still working or not. And if instead the test will fail, then the value of this test is not very high. All right, and what it results in is actually a pretty shocking situation. We have seen across the board that on average, at around 300, 350 tests, it is a full-time job for a person to maintain those tests in Selenium. Think about it. So in order to have more than 350 tests, you need to hire another QA engineer, and that is exactly where that challenge comes in, which I was mentioning with the budget. Imagine that you have a certain budget, and you hired certain number of engineers which you can afford under this budget, and at some point those engineers are just full-time on maintenance, and what's happening is that you can't build any more tests, and you're paying a lot of money to just maintain existing tests. So this is exactly the situation why a lot of companies are stuck at around 30% of test maintenance for years, literally not able to move anywhere. So we had to resort to manual testing in order to be able to resolve this situation. And yeah, so there you go. So this is where you get all of those issues coming up. Like this is why we have a lot of manual testing, because a lot of projects start with manual testing, which is completely sensible, and they just can't get past a certain percentages of test coverage because of combination of limited budget in conjunction with this ceiling based on test maintenance, induced by test maintenance. So now think about it. So technically, there are several layers of different types of testing you can do in your organization, and you probably should. You can do end-to-end testing, integration testing, and unit testing. Here, I'm specifically talking about end-to-end testing, specifically for UI for web and mobile applications, because those are the ones which usually have the challenge. However, those are exactly the type of tests which produce the most value if done right. So in theory, if you can figure out how to make those tests more stable and easier to deal with, require less maintenance, then the amount of value we have is huge. So this is because end-to-end tests are supposed to reflect how your end users are interacting with your application. All right, so let me, before jumping into demo, let me talk a little bit yet again about current state of end-to-end testing and the need of AI in the testing and how it should be used. So, well, first of all, we believe that end-to-end testing is by far the most important type of testing out there, because it's the only testing which actually reflects how your end users will be using your application. And because of that, it basically gives you guarantees to a certain degree that whatever is you're releasing will be working for your end users and the way it's supposed to. So number one challenge where it comes from literally the definition of end-to-end testing. The goal of end-to-end testing is to make sure that whatever you are releasing is working from end user's perspective. However, if you're looking into tools available on the market, especially Selenium and Appium, then you notice that this is not what they are doing. So if you're using Selenium, basically you are validating, you're dealing with HTML structure and elements in HTML structure, as opposed to dealing with the page purely from a user's perspective. And therefore, stuff might be passing in your test, whereas it shouldn't have been, because your end users might not be able to do that. For example, you can send events to elements which are not visible to an end user. Whereas end user would never be able to deal with those elements because we're just not accessible. For example, we have been overlapped with certain pop-up or something like that. Moreover, this reliance, as I was mentioning, introduce huge amount of maintenance. Any reliance whatsoever on HTML structure, any kind of HTML structure whatsoever, when writing end-to-end tests, is a conceptually incorrect way of building tests. Because this is not what your users are doing with your applications, and your goal is to make sure that you are reflecting what your users are doing. And this is exactly where we believe the AI produces the most value. Well, mind you, there are several ways how you can use AI in order to be able to improve your testing. Those are, number one, make it as close as possible to end user level testing as you can, and number two, you can aid yourself in generating tests using AI. So testRigor, for example, does both for companies which are specialized in one or another. And there are certain things which are just technically impossible if you're not relying on the AI. I can provide you some examples of those. And if you're not relying on AI, you might not be able to express things the way user sees it, and therefore you'll make your tests brittle and fragile just because instead of reflecting your end user's perspective, they are relying on all of those details of implementation. Okay, by now I believe we should have results of a poll available. Sarah, do we have that?
Yeah, just click over to the polls tab and you'll see the numbers there. Under opened.
Okay, great. So it looks like from what we see is confirming what I was talking about. The vast majority of respondents on this call also have anywhere between 0 to 30% of test cases covered, and lack of personnel with skills in test automation is mentioned as a top reason. Second top reason would be struggling to determine what should be automated versus manual, and second, interesting enough, second percentage in test coverage is actually between 50-70%, although it is several times smaller compared to 0 to 30%. So if you have 0 to 30% of your test cases automated, this is not an exception. This is more or less average. All right. So you should be able to see my screen. 1 second. Let me do it again. All right, so that should be it. So great. Let me show you in a little bit more details of what testRigor is doing and how testRigor is implementing different types of AI And we currently at this point do not believe that it is technically possible to just rely on 100% AI only approach to test automation. We see AI is a kind of a next level improvement in ability to produce better tests and ability to produce tests easier. So the first thing that how testRigor uses AI is literally natural language processing. It is a combination, of course, of parser and NLP, but point being is it allows you to express tests in English from end user's perspective. Remember, I spent a lot of time talking about that concept of relying on details of an implementation is incorrect specifically for end-to-end tests. Mind you, if you're doing unit tests, this is very much appropriate. However, not so much for end-to-end tests. So this is why we basically came up with a way to allow you to express steps in English from end user's perspective. Because think about it, how would, if you want to express things from end user's perspective, how would you do it? There are probably a lot of different ways how you do it. There were attempts by some companies to guess it based on AI. We do not believe that it is technically possible right now because only you as a human know the intent and what is exactly right way of finding certain elements. And this is why we believe that English language is probably the way to express it, the way that both agile enough and powerful enough and stable enough and reflective of end user's perspective. So yes, this is English example of validation. Click with relative location, entering data, and of course you can group your steps and give them arbitrary names. We call those reusable rules, or you can call them functions, and I can get to that in a second. So now let me get into specifically next level, and this is where much more AI is being used in order to execute those tests. So now, okay, so let's say testRigor understood what you're trying to say there. Now it's time to execution, and here this is where the most interesting stuff coming into play, because actually the way we human talk about things is different how usually computers do process them and how engineers usually code things like that. Of course, there are simple stuff which you can express, such as click communication preferences or enter product into search products. However, there are more human-like things which you can say, such as enter test into first name or enter rigor into last name. Here, enter test into first name, it sounds very natural for us humans. However, technically, there might be no correlation whatsoever between the text which is above this input, which reads first name, and the input below, where data actually need to be inputted into. And this is exactly the difference between how engineers refer to elements in HTML structure and how humans refer to elements on the page or mobile screen. In testRigor, you can literally say things like enter test into first name. And remember, I was mentioning that testRigor emulates how humans would do it. So it will be able to identify that this text looks as if it is related to the input below, and therefore, if you're trying to enter something into text like that, you're most probably referring to input below, and therefore it will go ahead and enter this stuff below. The next interesting thing, which again, where humans are different how they do things versus how machine usually do things is that humans, even though we tend to resort to doing things what we call automatically, de facto or on autopilot, some would say, de facto, it's actually we're doing it from scratch every single time. Let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say this first name text tomorrow will be on the left of this input. For us humans, then we have an instruction to enter text in the first name. It does not matter because as soon as we understand that first name is related to this input, we will still be able to enter the data in there. Of course, a day after tomorrow, it might become a placeholder like an input above. So first name. Again, as a human, if you are able to find it somehow, like then we will find it and enter this data. This is exactly what testRigor, for example, emulates. And this is an example of AI like we are doing to help to execute the instructions. Well, of course, there are more interesting situations. This is why I usually show this page. There are two identical buttons on this page. And of course, you can use human language to express clicking on the second one as opposed to on the first one. Think about it. How would you do it? It usually could be things like click on update in change your password section, which probably would be the most natural, or click on update below change your password, or click on a second update, or click on a second update in account settings section, and thousands of different other ways, depending what makes sense in the business context. So as you can see here, we are not relying on any details of implementation here when we're referring to elements like this. And number two, we're not affected by anything internally, such that duplicate IDs, accidental changes of internal information, which can break the test, and so on and so forth. And another question and another good example of using of classical vision-based machine learning is dealing with those icons. As you can see, there is icon which looks like user and map and card. And testRigor, you can enable machine learning-based image classification. It will assign labels to these icons so that you can naturally express how to deal with those by saying click user, click map, click card, which will be literally as stable as you would do it as a human. So this is kind of an example with forms. However, there is even more extreme example with tables where tools like Selenium have a really huge challenge dealing with. For example, let's say you need to delete this second row based on this unique ID, right? Technically, you would want to say something like click on delete icon in column actions and row containing SPK2, which is basically how you say it in testRigor. However, if you look into implementation and see how would you do it with Selenium, you'll probably rely on some XPath. Let me open it and show you here. So this is how it looks like. Of course, instead of a second row, you'll be able to construct your XPath to find a row containing certain ID. As you can see here, it's still being a little bit fragile because yes, you are relying on structure of HTML in order to identify tables, rows, and columns. However, you're relying on say column with the data being third and the link being second, and so on and so forth. Just that is already fragile. However, imagine the situation where engineers need to update the library which renders tables for security reasons right now. We literally have no time to do that because somebody have found a huge security vulnerability affecting current version of their library which renders tables for them. And they update it and about to release it. As you can see, the result looks almost identical. However, if you look into how it is being implemented, you'll notice that there is no longer any tables there. It is div-based rendering, and if you try to use XPath, it will look something like this. So what does it mean? It would mean that two things. Number one, all of your tests will fail because there is no longer same structure in place to render tables. And number two, it would be really hard, close to impossible, to provide anything stable enough to refer to elements on that page because there is no structure here anymore. It's all based on divs. However, testRigor, exactly the same testRigor instruction will continue to function because literally from a user's perspective, it is identical. So why is this all happening in general? There are two reasons. So number one, so when Selenium was invented, XPath played a little bit different role at the time because HTML was considered to be a structured language, and it was considered to have a clean structure into the page, right? It was considered like hypertext language where you just provide a structural part and that's it. Like just render your text. This is what was originally invented as. And of course, if you provide XPath for clearly structured HTML page, it is a perfectly well-defined reference in that structure, like we have seen with, for example, table example, right? It has its own limitations, but it's okay. There is a structure. However, in 2022, nobody uses HTML as a structured language anymore. HTML is used just as a language to place different parts of HTML in its place on the page, which have nothing to do with structure whatsoever. It is just a bunch of divs and spans and such, which are bunched up all together in order to produce visual effects and place things into their locations such that for users it looks like this, right? So point here being that the original idea of HTML had been lost. It's no longer representing the structure, and HTML is used just for position element with no structure whatsoever. And of course, because all of that changes all the time, because nobody cares about how it is rendered exactly, sometimes changing it dramatically in order to be able to achieve certain things. Like, for example, div-based rendering for tables will allow you to achieve more, your tables working a little bit better in a situation of mobile. Is point being is structure is not there. However, is like the technology had not been caught up. This is only part of the problem. The second part, as I keep mentioning, is that it's not just even about the reliance on structure, or certain elements which are inherently are not part of the structure oftentimes, such as those labels, as I mentioned, or section names, or and so on and so forth. We can find a lot of different examples, or for example, with how those icons looks exactly. So those things which are just things which we as humans are inherently processing differently compared to how it is technically coded in HTML. And this is why, in order to be able to produce better tests which are reflective of how your end users are actually using your application, you want to have a way to express it purely from end user's perspective. Your best bet is to avoid dealing with HTML structure and like all of those internal elements, and rely purely on how it looks from a user's perspective, which is impossible sometimes without using of AI. So this is basically the point in here. And one last thing, kind of a bonus I can mention is how users usually use testRigor. As you can see here, I was mentioning those rules. If you go to Reusable Rules on the left, let's find these rules. As you can see, it's just a name to a sequence of steps. That's it. However, our customers use those the way such that they literally copy paste their own terminology from their own test cases into name of the rules. For example, if you were to test Amazon, Amazon would have rules such as checkout, add to cart, find element, and so on and so forth. Find product, sorry, so on and so forth. And once this terminology is outlined, then what our customers do, they just literally go in. I kid you not, the majority of our customers do exactly that. They copy paste their test cases into testRigor, and with as little cleanup as it's technically possible. You might need login, most probably the format of the how it is been written needs to be cleaned up. The names of the rules must match. Everything should be on new line. The validation might be a little bit better. That's usually about it. You can literally make those rules executable out of the box, because testRigor would literally just execute those using your rules to get into lower level steps, and executing those steps emulating how humans would do that. So this is how our customers achieve 15 times more or higher speed of test creation compared to Selenium. At any point on that, I would like to make sure that I will answer the questions. If you have any questions, or feel free to chat to me. I'm ready. I'm open for questions. All right. So, okay. So there are several questions coming in. First is, what type of reporting does testRigor support? Excellent question. There are several types of report. It will represent or how your tests are going through your application in a tree fashion. Then there is, of course, a breakdown of how your tests look on different browsers. And most interestingly, which our customers like the most, is a breakdown on what have been broken based on labels. You can assign labels, as you can see in here, to the tests. And in the report, you can see the breakdown, what was happening per label. Usually that would mean different sections of your application, how different sections of your application perform around the test. For example, everything might be green, but specifically certain sections, certain types had been broken. And of course, we working with our customers on more. Specifically, if you are in medical record space, we help our customers to achieve with CFR Part 11 compliance, but providing reports to help improve that the functionality is performing as expected. Next question is how to choose which automation framework is more suited for my application. I believe that is more question about what kind of testing are you doing, and what is the current situation, and what kind of resources do you have, and so on and so forth. For example, so if you're talking about unit testing, then probably you want to research unit testing, which is specific to the framework you are using. Every single framework on the market have its own unit testing framework, which is specific to that stuff. There's a lot of good ones across the board, great ones, I would say, which you should use. And mind you, you probably do want to use unit testing. However, if you have manual testing and tests executed manually, and you have manual, especially if you have people who are doing manual testing full time, because at some point the amount is so large, then we believe that simply a testRigor might be the best choice, because it will allow your non-technical testers to be able to use the framework to automate away their most tedious regression tests. Because if you think about it, you'll always be able to find more interesting work and more appropriate work for humans to do, such that at a minimum branch testing instead of regression testing. Next question is, does testRigor work with iframes? And the answer is yes, it does. Not only that, but it also supports nested iframes, iframes in iframes, shadow DOMs in iframes, iframes and shadow DOMs in iframes, and so on and so forth. As those crazy situations with multiple levels of nestedness we have seen across the board, and testRigor will completely make it transparent, as if there is no iframes there whatsoever, allowing you to say express exactly the same things the same way. Because think about it, those are examples of details of implementation, and your users don't necessarily care if certain part of the page is rendered in iframe, which is oftentimes the case for checkout flows if you use libraries like Stripe and so on and so forth. From the end user's perspective, all of those fields are part of your page. And if we were to talk about that, or exactly how you write those in your own test cases, is in English from end user's perspective, not mentioning an iframe. I'm sure your test cases don't mention the fact that, let's say, this portion of the page is an iframe. Your test cases most probably would say things like enter like new email into email field and click update or something like that. This is exactly what testRigor will allow you to do. And to simplify it again, yes, testRigor works transparently with iframes. Next question is, does testRigor handle SSO MFA? And surprisingly, the answer is yes. If you go to documentation, we have several types. As you can see in here, you can see example tests by people who have chosen to have their tests public on testRigor platform, similar to how you would have your code open sourced on GitHub. Our customers also have access to Zendesk and their Q&A part and so on and so forth. So if you go into documentation, it is publicly available there is a reference from landing page. And there is this section. There we go. Here related to text messages. So there are different types of MFA, like the types related to email-based MFA, text-based MFA, there's probably often used ones. There is also phone call-based MFA and authenticator application-based MFA. And basically, you can do any of those with testRigor. Specifically, an example. This is an example of a 2FA login with SMS using testRigor. So here we do the click sign in. You're providing some data to sign in, click verify me. Then you check the phone number for messages. You extract it and extract the code from that message, because it probably have some other text in there, and save it as confirmation code. And then you just enter that confirmation code into code and click continue to log in and so on. There are also examples I can show you. How did you do that exactly? SSO might mean a little bit different things. For example, you might have, there are two types of things when we're talking about SSO: testing SSO and logging in into testRigor using SSO. If you're talking about testing SSO, this is completely transparent. Example would be if you're using Okta for managing your users, or some other like Auth0, for example, then from testRigor's perspective is completely transparent. testRigor will basically work with pages as user. If you click on a button and you are redirected to third-party website in order to be able to log in, testRigor will just work with that page as if it's on your website. It will allow you to enter credentials, click login, and then most probably you'll be redirected back to continue the flow. And testRigor, what it does is just works with pages. It does not work on any technical level with like URLs or anything like that. And it will like follow the pop-ups and all this kind of stuff by default. So it just makes it very streamlined and experience to deal with this. Another part which you might be referring to when you're talking about SSO is SSO in order to be able to use testRigor. And yes, we have a lot of enterprise customers like Netflix, Splunk, and so on and so forth. And almost all of our customers use single sign-on. We support single sign-on with Google, Microsoft, Okta. With Okta is a little bit more advanced, where you can specify different groups and divide projects between groups and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different stuff. The point being is you'll be able to use your SSO provider in order to be able to log in into testRigor, of course. Oh, okay. So we have more questions. I apologize. I needed to scroll in here. Could you show some failed run? How to understand the problem? Is test or a product problem? Exceptionally great question. So testRigor has a certain set of tools to help you to deal with a huge number of test cases. Specifically, we have customers which have tens of thousands of tests per project. If you're dealing with test cases on that level, then it would be just a huge nightmare to have something like a Selenium or something like that. Imagine that you have 10,000 tests automated, and next thing you know is engineering released some update, and now 5,000 of tests failed. It's a disaster in case of Selenium, because now it's a huge effort in terms of engineering time to go to each individual test to figure out what exactly happened. testRigor helps you to deal with those, and it automatically extracts unique issues potentially affecting more than one test, like in this particular example. Moreover, like in the example where I gave you, like there's 5,000 tests failed, testRigor will show, yes, there's 5,000 tests failed. However, there are only two unique issues, one affecting one test and one affecting 5,000 tests. So it's just that feature on its own is the huge helper in terms of test maintenance. Moreover, you will be able to see steps to reproduce because and basically steps will be in plain English with screenshot on every test. And because testRigor takes screenshot every single time you run, you'll be able also to see a screenshot of last successful run and compare them to current run, so that it would be very obvious that what exactly is going on. So testRigor makes it very easy to see what happened, and based on that, you'll be able to assess what is going on, if it's something you need to adapt to because product changed, or is it a bug in test case, or is actually an issue. Moreover, let's say it is a legitimate change from engineering where you need to adapt your functionality. It's very easy to do because testRigor tests are not just plain English, it's plain text. testRigor does not have any hidden functionality whatsoever. In addition to these specifications, it's literally as is and executed as is. So let's say you need to this text had changed, and find all instances and replace selected, and bam, just like that, you adopted all your tests right there. And of course, you can create a Jira ticket with one click, which will be a pretty nice Jira ticket. It will save you a little bit of time and happiness for you and engineers, because there will be steps to reproduce in English. Because remember, testRigor is in English with a link to see a screenshot related to each of the steps. So definitely we try to make it as simple as possible to understand what's going on. And of course you can also look into these issues on case-by-case basis and test cases, and see same thing on the test case and understand why the test case has failed. Okay. Do we have an option to import test cases built using testRigor into Selenium, a Selenium Java-based framework? There is no such functionality at this moment. So with our customers, we sometimes signing an agreement, and in case if something goes really bad and the customer would want to move out, we will convert those tests one time into Selenium tests. But as soon as you are moving out from testRigor platform, you're losing two extremely important things. Number one, you're losing the ability for non-technical people to be able to understand what is going on with your tests. This is a big deal because now your product managers no longer will be able to review your test and give you feedback if it is indeed what we were expecting, and your manual testers wouldn't be able to help you to build tests. And number two, you're losing on test maintenance big times. Unfortunately, so remember, we have this sophisticated way of referring to elements. And yes, Selenium 4 does have some nice basic level features where we have some relative locations and so on and so forth. However, it is nowhere near the level of what you can do on testRigor. And of course, we're lacking image classification, association with labels, working with tables, and so on and so forth. So that means that if you were to convert anything like that, in those cases where Selenium doesn't support something, you'll have to resort to using XPaths, meaning that you're just basically making all your tests ultra fragile right there and losing the whole point of testRigor. So this is complicated question. So it is yes and no in a sense. Can testRigor support handle multiple windows and native events? And can testRigor handle multiple windows and native events? The answer is actually yes. So we have built over time all of these things. So there's basic commands available here, and if you scroll down, you'll notice that there are commands which are related to working with multiple browsers and devices. So not only that, you can run multiple browsers and multiple devices at the same time, switching between them at will, basically. It's just as simple as saying, switch to this device, kick off a new browser, start a device, and so on and so forth. And basically, what that means in particular is that you will be able to test features like chat, even if it is a chat between two browser windows, because when you start a new browser, it's a completely separate instance with completely separate cookies and session. So you can log in into one user in one browser and to another user in another browser and validate that your chat and stuff like that is working. And yes, we support a lot of stuff related to like pop-ups, notifications, and stuff like that around the browser. And of course, anything you can think of is mobile. Do you have options to run test a remote machine against devices in Perfecto? Excellent question. Yes, indeed. If you go to settings, it's confusingly part of integration. You can use third-party external providers such as browser tech, Lambda tests, Source Labs. For some reason, didn't pop up in here. For me, maybe I just, there you go. This is Source Labs in here. And many other stuff coming up. So by default, when you're dealing with devices on testRigor, you're dealing with simulators and emulators. However, you can use actual physical devices for mobile testing using any platform. There are multiple coming up soon, will be listed in here. Does it support DDT and what kind of sources? DDT? I'm not exactly sure what DDT means exactly. I apologize. Please clarify your question. I don't know what DDT means. If you mean BDD, then yes, in actually very advanced form, you can write executable specification. Remember, those are all English and plain text in English before engineering is done. And then the last question, we are at the time right now, does testRigor work behind firewall? And yes, indeed it does. So there are several ways how our customers connect to their in VPN internal environment. So there are things like IP whitelisting, tunnels, and you can deploy the whole testRigor on premise. So this way, everything literally will be on premise. Moreover, testRigor can hook up into your existing grids, like Open grids, Selenium grids. It will work probably not as great for if you're using external grid, because you lose some of the functionality that we will be able to simulate if you manage device directly. But it is possible to use anything you can think of internally. And yes, our customers do that. On that, I apologize. We are very much over time.
So many great questions, though, today.
Yep, I appreciate everyone asking the questions. The questions are really awesome. I enjoyed answering this question. Thank you so much, guys.
Very good. That concludes our event for today. Thank you, Artem, for your time, and testRigor for sponsoring this web seminar. And of course, a special thank you goes out to our audience for spending the last hour with us. Have a great day. We hope to see you at a future event. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And don't hesitate to connect me on LinkedIn.